Welcome to Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Religion Reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Joining me is Senior Managing Editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
Before we start, we remind you about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a donation as small as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcasts, our complete newsletter, and all of our religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com /Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's episode. Pornography, broadly defined as sexually explicit images, has become a sort of wallpaper of modern lives. It is everywhere, in our books, movies, computers, video games, social media posts, music, and phones. For many years, leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints warned members that porn was dangerous, evil, and damnable. They taught that viewing porn was a sin. In the past decade, though, the Church has suggested that repeated porn watching is an addiction, like alcohol and drugs, often requiring professional help to overcome. Earlier this month, Apostle Patrick Kearon addressed attendees at the Utah Coalition Against Pornography conference, saying he was no expert, but acknowledging he did have, quote, painful and heartbreaking personal experience with loved ones entrapped by addictions. Some Latter-day Saint therapists now question the addiction hypothesis. Cameron Staley, author of Confessions of an LDS Sex Researcher and creator of the Life After Pornography online program, is among them. He joins us today virtually to discuss the issue. Cameron, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you both.
Okay, first question. The Church defines pornography as, quote, any depiction in pictures or writing that is intended to inappropriately arouse sexual feelings. Is that how you would define it? Is that how you do define it?
Yeah, I'd say typically when I'm working with folks, I ask them to describe, what they're viewing, how they define it. And what I hear is people are sometimes just looking at attractive people that are fully dressed or partially dressed or naked, or it could be moving images where they're engaging in sexual acts. So there's a pretty big range, but I think typically for me, I think about porn as viewing individuals engaging in some type of sexual act.
So what's wrong with it?
Well, I think there's a couple things. So pornography, it's not intended to be a source of sex education. And it's definitely not appropriate for children or adolescents. Like, that's not what it is. It doesn't teach healthy principles around consent or non-exploitation or safe sex practices or having shared values. So without having proper literacy that pornography is a type of adult entertainment, it could contribute to unrealistic expectations for performance or appearance or behaviors, things that are kind of contrary to intimacy and open dialogue.
What about the women aspect?
That's the other part. So I think a lot of porn is very male-centric. And the more I've learned about sexuality, I think it often works best when it's more female-centric or more balanced. And that's typically not what's depicted in pornography. So it kind of sets up a scenario that's not going to be ideal for what we know about anatomy and sexual response and pleasure in relationships. So it's kind of backwards.
It's kind of misogynist, a lot of it.
A lot of it is, for sure.
So, Cameron, we talked a little bit about this before, but is quote, viewing pornography the problem? Is that mainly a male problem, or do women have the problem too?
Yeah, I think that is important. So I think as I hear a lot of people talk about porn concerns, they often frame it as this is a male problem. And yet I work with lots of women who also struggle with pornography viewing. And so I think that excludes kind of a growing portion of those that struggle with porn. And I found often a lot of the women that I work with experience even more shame. It's like, not only am I struggling with sexual behaviors, but this is a male, quote, concern. How could I talk about this or open up about this? So I think it is helpful to talk about human sexuality in general. And there are individuals who struggle with pornography I tend to see more men in counseling and then men and women in couples work, but I absolutely work with women that are struggling with this. And it's been really devastating for them to navigate that and what that means for their own identity and relationships and salvation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it is important to broaden that this isn't a gendered-specific struggle.
So, Cameron, how do you define addiction, and do you see porn as addictive?
Yeah, this is probably the question I get the most. And so
That's why we asked it.
No. And addiction is maybe one of my least favorite terms, so I'll do my best.
Okay.
So addiction, typically, there's lots of definitions, but it's often defined as a chronic medical disease that disrupts healthy functioning. It can be life-threatening if untreated. That's typically what we think about with addiction. But it can also be defined as using a substance or engaging in behavior that can be compulsive, that continues despite harmful consequences. So there's lots of different definitions there.
So what's the difference between compulsive behavior and addiction?
I think there's some really key differences. So I think sometimes we use those terms interchangeably, but when I think about a compulsion, it's typically a behavior that we engage in to reduce or control an unwanted emotion or a physical sensation or some kind of an urge. And so what's important when I'm working with folks, we start to learn together that there's typically an emotion that precedes an urge to view pornography. And it's often that emotion that is not recognized or understood, and we just kind of obey the urges and continue. And so if we can better understand the emotions and address those and meet those needs, we can better manage kind of those urges. Where an addiction would put more emphasis on the substance or the thing you're viewing or engaging in, having more of an irresistible pull or something that's more biological or neurological in nature that's driving that. But what we found is what's driving a lot of compulsive sexual behavior are these emotional states that we tend to neglect. But people want to disregard that and say, no, it's got to be the brain. There's got to be something else going on. And it's like, no, seriously, like emotions organize us for action. They drive us to do all kinds of things. And so those that struggle with porn and substance use tend to be less aware of their emotions. And so a lot of the treatment is increasing awareness. And the more you can do that, the better you can navigate those urges or cravings.
Cameron, let me ask you, just as an example, for instance, is there a difference? How would you see the difference between, say, adolescent boys, for instance, peeking at a Playboy, and adult men regularly viewing hardcore videos?
Yeah, I think there are some important differences. So when I think about adolescents, a lot of them are viewing sexual images because they're curious. They don't know what sexuality is about. They don't know kind of what bodies look like. Some of that is part of kind of sexual development. So a lot of it is coming from sexual desire, kind of raging hormones, all those things that we experience at that time. And so for adults, it could be similar. But for other adults, they might also be viewing as a coping strategy, not just as a way to experience a sexual act, but they might be viewing as a way to regulate stress or loneliness or shame or fears. And so that's the part where it tends to shift over time, where it's not just a sexual experience. It may be used to manage other states that are undesirable. And so as I work with adults, sometimes they're viewing and it's like, I don't even enjoy this anymore. But this is what I do when I'm alone or when I'm struggling or overwhelmed. It's a coping strategy. But usually when you're younger, it's more kind of curiosity and kind of sexual drive.
So back to the addiction question for a second. It does seem like if you call it an addiction, then it does make people, I would think it would let people sort of off the hook, like, well, I couldn't control this. I looked at it once and I was hooked, as if it were a drug.
Yeah.
Whereas if you talk about it not as an addiction, but also not necessarily as sin, it seems like it would be easier to get to those deeper emotional things. Am I wrong about that?
You're right on, Peggy. And that's, I think, where people make that big pivot and start to better navigate those urges a lot better is if you over-identify with the struggle that you have and say, I'm an addict, well, the behaviors I'm doing are addict behaviors. Like it's part of this disease that's uncontrollable. And so there's been researchers that looked at, where did this addiction language come from and how did it kind of enter churches and evangelical faiths? And it really came to try to make sense of, why are people that believe this is sinful still doing it? And it's like, well, they're not rebelling against God. It's got to be this disease process. They can't control it. And so I think it initially entered to reduce a sense of shame and responsibility. But then when you take that away, it keeps people stuck. So if you let go of that addiction identity and language and say, actually, this is something that you are choosing. This is a coping strategy. There are emotions driving that. We can choose other things, but this is a choice we're making. Our behaviors are 100% in our control. This is something that we are choosing. And from that standpoint, it really does unlock agency and helps people facilitate making better choices that are consistent with their values.
So do you think pornography should be against the law?
Against the law? Well, this is above my pay grade. This is in a different field. I think with anything, there needs to be proper education and some boundaries where this is not something that's good for children and adolescents as part of their education or development. But other adults, are able to make some decisions. And so pornography is not something that I choose to view personally. It's not consistent with my values or kind of within the boundaries of my relationship, but that might be different for other people. And so I work with lots of people that make all kinds of different decisions, and I'm not as focused on kind of managing the decisions that they make or their types of leisure activities. But for me, it's not something that I choose to view. So I don't really get into that sphere of kind of what to regulate for other folks.
So Cameron, we've sensed, covering the church, some dialing back, at least, and changes, at least, in how top church leaders address pornography in their sermons. It seemed like at one point during General Conference, the subject sort of dominated. It came up in lots and lots of talks. What's your take on that? Have you sensed that?
Oh, for sure. And I remember when I was doing my residency down at BYU's Counseling Center, this was, I got to do the math now, 13, 14, 15 years ago, I can't remember. It seems like around General Conference time when those talks were kind of at the height, people would come in crisis. Hearing those things because of their pornography concerns. It was incredibly distressing. And now I've seen a shift. And one of my favorite quotes is from LDS Apostle M. Russell Ballard, who's passed away. And he said this in 2017. So this has been 7 or 8 years ago. And he said this at a BYU address, that too many men and women suffer in silence because we have unintentionally demonized those who are addicted to pornography. Parents, family members, and friends can do much more to help those in trouble by being willing to listen and offer support and encouragement. I felt like that was a powerful acknowledgement that, given so much focus on this, we might have made this a lot more difficult for people. And then President Oaks talked about that, not everyone is addicted, and using that language is pretty unhelpful. Like, there's levels of involvement. We should be really careful in using that addiction language, particularly with adolescents. That often doesn't fit what's going on. Let's be really careful with that. And the church handbook has kind of changed language around addiction and talks about compulsion more. So there's definitely been a big shift. And I've seen people better able to navigate that because the messaging has shifted as well.
So you're saying that is more effective as you see it?
Yeah, I believe so. And I was just Googling the church's counseling resources website again today just to check out some of the language and resources that are there. And right there on their webpage, it says, be cautious in labeling individuals as addicts. The majority of folks that view should not be considered addicts, especially those who are adolescents. Help them to recognize their true identity as children of God, and help them to take responsibility for their choices and seek out professional help and recognize the emotions that are driving these behaviors. So all that's right on the church's resources on counseling support. So I think a lot of that messaging is getting a lot better.
Cameron, I don't know that there's any research on this. Is there any research that shows the percentage of Latter-day Saints who view porn? Is it higher, lower than other groups that have been studied? And I don't know how effective you can actually ask that question, in a research. What does the science show?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any specific data about LDS folks, but What I do know in general is religious individuals tend to view porn at lower rates than less religious individuals. But the key part is religious folks tend to perceive themselves to be addicted at higher rates, even though they are viewing at lower rates. So that perception of being addicted is definitely higher amongst religious folks, but actual viewing tends to be lower. Like being a religious person is a protective factor generally for viewing lots of pornography.
So why do you think the church remains so worried about it? You said it's not the topic it once was, but obviously they still hear about it.
Yeah, I think it's a big concern when there's such a focus on families and relationships and health and safety and a focus on development and the sacredness of creation. And so it is a big part, pretty central to kind of our belief system. And there's still a lot of fear around sexuality and what it means and just kind of normal expressions of sexuality. So that's the other part I appreciate on the church's resources, counseling resources, is they say is part of kind of overcoming this struggle is they encourage members to seek information about healthy sexuality and proper sexual expression and the role of a sex drive within the boundaries God has established. And so there is more of a balance instead of here's the things you shouldn't do. Here's actually the things we want to promote and cultivate and develop. And so there is a shift there. But I think often we're focused on here's the things we shouldn't do. But like the absence of a problem, like the absence of porn viewing doesn't equal good sexual health or happy marriages or fulfilling marriages. So like it might not facilitate it, but we got to do more than just eliminating problems. We actually need to grow things that are meaningful and important. So there is a shift there, but it's just kind of slower.
Do you think that Latter-day Saints just sometimes just don't understand human sexuality the way that's healthy to understand? Because I mean, it's taught as such a no-no outside of marriage, and then suddenly in marriage, it's so go for it. So I mean, is that come into play?
That's been my experience. Is the folks that tend to struggle more with porn are ones that grew up in a home where we didn't talk about it, and it like affection wasn't shown, and we keep our bodies covered up. There's kind of a lot of shame, discomfort around that. And kids are smart. If you grow up in a home where it's like, oh, we don't talk about this, it means there's something bad about it or dangerous about it. And then you're growing up and it's like, well, I'm kind of interested and find people attractive and have desire. And I was taught that that's sinful or bad. You know, what does that mean about me? And then it cultivates sexual development in isolation and in shame. And anytime we have that kind of trajectory, we're less likely to have conversation and discussions around sexuality. So I do see a lot of couples where it's like, you know, we've been faithful and good Latter-day Saints and we get married, this should be good. But we've never had a conversation about our interests, our desires, our expectations. And then very quickly, those expectations that are sometimes not even well understood amongst yourselves are violated, and there's hurt feelings, and all that fear enters in, and people kind of separate even more. And there's just all this discomfort, and that sexuality tends to continue to grow in that separation and isolation and not grow together as it should. And so a lot of people are like engaging in sexual behavior when they're not even comfortable having a conversation about it. And I wish we could flip that, where it's like, you know, if we can't talk about it, maybe you shouldn't do it. Like, let's get to that point where we talk about these things and have a conversation, a dialogue. But if that's not represented in the home, that's really difficult for people to do.
So pornography has been blamed for tearing apart marriages, relationships, some loved ones. So what's your advice, for instance, for a spouse who is married to a person who views porn and it's affecting their relationship?
Yeah, I think that was the message that I heard and believed too. And I'm like, oh no, like this is really dangerous. Mm-hmm. And then I started working with folks that struggle with porn. And I was really surprised at the kind of folks that struggle. And for the most part, the folks I work with are some of the best people I've ever met. They're very kind. They're very caring. They may be a little perfectionistic or overachieving, run a little on the anxious end. But often they're the ones serving in church and doing what they can to help other people. And I thought, this doesn't make sense. Like, why would these be the individuals kind of struggling with pornography? And so what I would say is see your partner for who they are. and not through this lens of the struggle.
Hmm.
That being said, I also know people that struggle with pornography that are quite callous and abusive and disrespectful and not safe. And I would say the same thing. Look at your partner, not the struggle. It's the partner that determines kind of the health and safety of a marriage. And so a lot of the couples I've worked with, this pornography struggle was an opportunity to learn more about themselves, improve communication understanding, and help them grow together. For others, they were with a partner that wasn't safe and caring and wanting to work on their part. And so it's less about the porn and more about the person in the relationship. So if you're wanting to help, I'd say find ways that you can relate. We all cope with things in life, emotions and stress, less than healthy ways through scrolling or overeating or shopping or gaming, you name it. So find ways we can relate, but also look at your partner. They may be the best, or they may not be. Like, it's important to have an honest kind of vision of who they are.
I mean, you've already kind of spoken to this, but how do you help members and others who want to stop? Like, someone comes to you and says, I really hate this about myself. I don't want to do this anymore. Help me.
Yeah.
What are the steps? And just go ahead.
This is the good news, Peggy, is we have good approaches that work, that are effective. So there's an approach called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. It's been around over 40 years. It's helpful with most mental health concerns, but definitely with compulsive sexual behavior. And so one of the research studies they did was at Utah State University, and they found that folks that have struggled for years and years were able to reduce their viewing by over 90% within 10 or 12 weeks of ACT. So this is the same approach they've been using at BYU's Counseling Center for 20, 25 years plus. It's the same approach I use in my work and in my online programs. So it's these principles of increasing awareness of what is driving the behaviors and focusing more on cultivating this life you want that's worth living instead of perpetually struggling with something really can help people navigate this much better. And it doesn't have to be a lifelong kind of struggle. With the right principles and approaches and skills, people can navigate this.
So I guess back to the addiction model, the church uses, lots of parts of the church use the 12-step program, which is the first thing is I can't do anything about this. I'm in, this addiction controls me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is the 12-step, is that a good thing? Is that the right thing for this?
Yeah, I would just speak to the folks I've worked with and the experiences they've had, where many of them have participated in 12-step programs and addiction approaches. And what they have found is that the group part is meaningful for connection and reducing shame, where it's like, I'm not the only one, and they're kind of like me. That's really helpful. But as far as like taking responsibility and disempowering, I haven't found that to be too helpful. And often people do need skills and principles about how the mind works to change behavior. So a couple of years ago, I was invited to train a bunch of the counselors for LDS Family Services, kind of in the Utah, Idaho area around ACT for porn concerns. And a lot of the clinicians are using ACT, which was great. And I thought the director, Sherilyn, she was wonderful. She just had a really good mind about how this works. And one thing she shared with me, I'd never heard before, but she said the church's addiction recovery program is intended to be a support group and not a treatment. I've never heard that before. And I thought that's a really helpful distinction. To say, if you're wanting support, this might be a place to get it. May not necessarily be the treatment you're looking for to reduce behaviors or change those. We have other things like acceptance and commitment therapy that can be really helpful, but this is more of a support group. And I've never heard that distinction before, but I found that to be really helpful.
And you're saying that that's one of the things that program does. Like they feel like they're not alone, a person in those programs, and there's a community there, the value of community, of helping, right?
I think that's huge. And that's what I hear from my clients over and over, where it's like that community, that connection is really helpful. I didn't find the structure and the guidelines, the 12 steps as helpful, but the connection piece was. But other principles like mindfulness, clarifying your values, pursuing those, learning about how sexuality works, those tend to be the helpful skills and practices that tend to change behavior.
Now, Patrick Kearon, the apostle, the newest apostle, actually in the quorum, when he gave this speech, he talked about getting professional help. Is that what people need? Do they need professional help if they really want to stop viewing porn? They feel like it's become compulsive or whatever.
I think there's a huge range as I work with folks that a lot of people can navigate these concerns as they just learn about healthy sexuality. And there's a lot of wonderful forums online where there's a lot of people wanting to learn about relationships and sexuality and share resources together and support each other with community. And that's helped people overcome this. Others do work with professionals that understand ACT principles that can help people develop the skills they need. And then others with that spiritual component do find some benefit working with church leaders to better understand like what repentance means or how to access like grace in your life and the Savior's atonement. So for some people, it's a combination. And what I've seen is sexuality and religion kind of co-inform each other and develop. So usually I have conversations about both with people. And a lot of people that struggle with religious OCD, which is called scrupulosity, tend to struggle with porn. So there is this component where my really high standards for morality and beliefs are the things that's causing my distress that I then cope with by viewing sexual images. And it's this really painful back and forth cycle. And so having a skilled clinician or a church leader that understands that, oh, wait, this isn't a worthiness thing or a righteousness thing. This is a mental health thing. Let's help you better navigate. That can be really key in helping people turn that corner.
One more question, and we've sort of addressed this and you've addressed it a little bit, but how would you, given what we've talked about and, your expertise, how would you advise church leaders to address the issue of pornography now? Do you think they're on the right track of how to address it? Any other words of wisdom you'd like to give?
Yeah, I think things are getting better, which is the good news. And I think the more we can help people see their worth and their value and their intentions, that typically people that struggle with porn do so because they desire connection. And there's these deep feelings of shame that have come from lots of different sources, and helping them recognize kind of that drive, that sexual desire is divine, it's healthy, that you're not a bad person. The more you can connect with that, the more you can kind of see yourself as you truly are. And then I found often what helps religious folks is continuing to participate in religious practices, if that's attending church or taking the sacrament or attending the temple or serving in callings or going on missions, that all those things that bring you meaning and purpose and connection generally help people navigate this better. And I think in the past, often the strategy was let's pull back on those things and restrict access. And that often facilitated more shame and disconnection and kind of amplified people's struggles. And so now I do see a shift there where people are encouraging continued worship and devotion and staying connected, which I think helps people tremendously better navigate this.
So Cameron Staley, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you both.
Thanks to Dave Noyce.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Nicole Weaver. We remind our listeners they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormonland newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormonland.